Well, it's a very great privilege today to welcome Dr. Warren Farrell, who's an old friend of mine. Hello, Warren.
Hello, it's been, I'm afraid to say it is pretty old. We met in the mid 80s, I guess it was, in your apartment.
Yeah, New York. I was in New York for 5 years, and I first heard about the work you were doing in relation to men, which really intrigued me. And I don't even remember. You told me you actually came and saw me in my apartment.
Yes,
which
yes.
I have a terrible memory. Anyway, but that was the beginning. We got into contact. You just published. Now let's go back a little bit. So you started off your career very much as an advocate for women. You wrote a famous book called The Liberated Man, which was very much about trying to persuade men that they were going to benefit from the women's movement.
Mhm.
And then you were elected 3 times to the National Organization for Women. So you were right up there as a white knight, may I say it, someone promoting feminism. And then, rather like me, you started to think about men and started to write about men. And when I met you, you just published one of your most important books, I think, which was Why Men Are the Way They Are. Do you want to tell me a little bit about all of that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was on the board of NOW in New York City and was very much I guess, probably the best known spokesperson for women's issues who was a man. And
Yeah.
I was speaking all around the world on this topic at that time and completely support the part of feminism that is expanding options for women, doing things like getting women involved in team sports and single, person sports. And there's so many dimensions of the women's movement that has really enhanced and enriched our lives. But there was also something else that was happening. When I was on the board in New York City, we were getting a lot of requests from women. No, that's not true. We were getting demands from women who were being divorced, saying, "I demand that you not have a position of equality of equal fathers and mothers opportunities to be with children after divorce. I know what's best for the children, and I want to be able to start a new life where I don't get involved with. I've learned about how to have a better man. I want to start a new life with a new man that I just met. Move to wherever we need to move to. I'll decide what's best for my children and take them in." So now faced a political dilemma, and the political dilemma was, do I go ahead and say to women, we are in favor of equality, that means equal time of the child with both mother and father, and lose your background and support, which would then undermine our political base to do a lot of other good things for women? Or do we take that our belief in equality and apply it to children's rights to both mother and father equally? And so there was a debate, and there was a legitimate both sides to this argument. But everyone ended up disagreeing with me and with a woman named Karen DeCrow, who was not on the New York City board, but she had been a national president of NOW. And the two of us became sort of alienated, especially myself, who said I thought it was really important for children to have access to both parents. But I didn't know for sure. We only had data that is now maybe 1970-ish that this happens, so almost 45-year-old data. And 45 years ago, we didn't have the longitudinal experience of what happens to children when they don't have an equal amount of father and mother. So I began to research that. That led to a book called Father and Child Reunion, but it basically led from my being doing very well financially to maybe losing multiple millions of dollars because I chose to sort of say, men are not, the two flaws of feminism were demonizing men and undervaluing the family, I came to understand. And so as I became articulate about that, I lost a lot of my feminist support.
Yeah, it's not a good career move to start supporting men publicly.
It's funny. Susan Faludi came to my house and interviewed me for Backlash. And she said that the reason you got involved with men's issues is because you make a lot more money that way. And I said, Susan, write a book supporting men's issues, even a minimal amount, and see if it outsells Backlash. Well, Backlash was for about 26 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, and her book that did come out of interviews that was reasonably empathetic to men, it got great publicity at the beginning, but it just did not sell.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I had the same thing, of course. My original background was sex therapy, and I had 10 years of promoting sex, and I did very well. And when I started to promote men, it didn't do me any good at all in terms of speaking engagements, in terms of public support, in terms of access to mainstream media. And I remember someone saying to me, "Oh, you've given up sex to support men because you'll make a lot more." It's exactly the same thing. You'll make more money. You have to be kidding. What's happened to you is also a sign of how feminism is tilted from being originally about equality, about promoting opportunities for women, to really working extremely hard to play down any discussion of men's issues, as of course we saw with Kathy J and the Red Pill.
Yes.
And, they have a ferocious grip on our society now. So anyway, moving on, Warren, you then went on to write a whole series of books about men, which have been terribly important, and most particularly your new book, which is called The Boy Crisis, which has been published this month. Maybe you could show us that, the cover of the book.
Oh, sure, yes.
Yeah, because I want to mainly focus on that today.
Looks a lot better than my face, doesn't it?
Yeah, no. Anyway, I'm terribly excited about that. I think, as always, you've done a wonderful job compiling a huge amount of information. You're very methodical in your research, and there's fantastic. I really advise that people have a look at this book because it brings together extraordinary information that I didn't know. And I just want to mention some of the things that I found really interesting. In particular, I was just gobsmacked by research asking parents to be whether they wanted their firstborn to be a boy or a girl, and that dads almost twice as likely to prefer a daughter to a son. And I found that so tragic. Can you tell me why you think that is?
Yes, and I guess one of the fathers that I spoke to really just put it all together. I first asked in the earlier part of our dinner party evening, would you enjoy a son more or a daughter more? And he said, I guess playing with my son would be just wonderful, and just we could rough and tumble. I wouldn't have to worry about my wife Mary suggesting that I was being too rough with him nearly as much as I would if I had a daughter. And his eyes lit up. And then a little bit later in the evening, I said, so your wife is pregnant, so what do you prefer for you to have? And he said, even though I'd enjoy playing with my son more, I'd want it to be a girl. And I said, why? And he said, because a girl has more opportunities today. Girls are more admired and respected today. It's a better world for girls today than it is for boys. So he didn't say this, but in essence, the bottom line was, I'll give up my fun and for something that's better for my child, which I thought was very touching, and that reflects the aggregate data as well.
What the research shows. Yeah, my son has just had a little daughter, my first grandchild. I mean, said the same. Where he said he preferred a daughter. I mean, and I hear that a lot. And to me, it really reflects an awareness in our community that boys are having a hard time, which is, of course, what your book is all about, that boys are in trouble, that it's very hard raising boys and raising confident boys in a society where boys get very little encouragement, where boys are blamed for, men and boys are blamed for all sorts of things in our society unfairly. And I mean, I just think that's such a telling piece of research about where we are now. But just going on, the other one I found incredibly striking was the fact that this is the first generation of boys we're seeing now who are going to end up less educated than their parents. Can you tell me about that?
Yes, all 60, and this what I'm going to say next is really where I got myself energized to say something needs to be done about the boy crisis. And these more than 60 of the largest developed nations, boys are falling behind girls in almost all academic areas, but especially in reading and writing. Reading and writing are the two biggest predictors of success. And so I started asking myself, what's common to all developed nations? And what was common is that developed nations, because they had a bit more access to survival, were able to allow permission for two things. One was for divorce, and the second is for children to be able to be born to mothers who were not married. And so I looked carefully at those two groups. And in both groups, there were a huge percentage of boys who were doing terribly, but there was a decent percentage of boys doing pretty well. And so I started breaking those two groups down more finitely. And I found that in the boys that were doing poorly had in common that they had no father involvement or very minimal father involvement. The boys that were doing well had significant father involvement. It is just that boys are falling so far behind not only girls, but where they were. But the tragedy in that statement, though, is even greater for this reason. That boys who, like if our grandfathers didn't do well academically, they could immediately use their physical body and they could use their muscle. But we have been a world that has morphed from muscle dependency to the mental, from muscle to mental, or from muscle to microchip. And so in the world of mental and microchip, if you don't graduate from high school, you have a more than 20% chance of being unemployed. And an unemployed man is not desirable. Women don't say, "Oh, he's reading the boy crisis. He must, and he's in an unemployment line. I'm really interested in him because he's educating himself," that type of thing. And so he then becomes left out of female selection, and then a woman gets frustrated and she has a child without a father, and then the whole process continues.
Absolutely. And then the other thing I noticed was the suicide figures, and you've got incredible data showing these leaps upward from about age 10 in the suicide rate of young boys.
You're absolutely right. At the age of 9, both boys and girls have almost zero suicide, and it's even. Between the ages of 10 and 14, though, as boys begin to develop their hormones and testosterone and get a little bit adjusted to the male role expectations and pressures, the boys' suicide rate doubles that of girls. The age of 15 and 19, when all that sets in even more, it's quadruple that of girls. By the ages of 20 to 24, it is almost 6 times that of girls. And so you get a sense, but no, we don't, obviously if this was happening to girls, that their suicide rate was going from equal to boys to by the age of the mid-20s, 6 times that of boys, we would all know that all over the world. And that would be absolute evidence as to how the world discriminates against girls. The reverse, we don't see it.
Because I've been fighting. We've got a national suicide prevention body, and I've been talking to them for years and years and years about this, trying to get them to address the fact that it's particularly a male problem. The 7 people who kill themselves every day in Australia, 5 of them are male, and they emphatically refuse, because they kept on saying women attempt suicide as much, or if not more, than men. I would have thought the fact that men succeed is a bit of a difference. We don't have as good figures on the boys that I could find, but we do have a doubling of suicide rates between teens and 20s for boys.
Yes.
So it is a dire problem.
Because
sorry, go on, Mark.
Because you're so helpful to the Australian Society about the suicide, let me help clarify to the listener here what the difference is between committing suicide and attempting suicide. Attempting suicide is part of the solution. Attempting suicide is a way of saying, I do have people out there who care. I need to have the people who care about me move me from the back burner of their life to the front burner of my life. That's number one. Number two, it is a way of saying, I do believe that people are capable of helping me, and if I speak up, they will want to help me. So a woman signals...
It's sort of cry for help, the traditional.
It's definitely a cry for help. And but the internal belief is, if I cry for help, someone wants me to be alive and will listen. The internal belief for the boy who commits suicide is that there's no one who loves me, no one who needs me.
Yeah.
There's no hope of that changing. If I do express my weakness and failure and fear of life to anyone who does respect me, he or she will only decrease respect for me. If I tell this to my girlfriend, she'll run. If I tell this to a guy at school, he'll go, and so it's a feeling of hopelessness, and it's one of the reasons I created this 60 plus inventory of depression and suicide, because I found that we were measuring depression in males in the same way that we were measuring it in females. And in fact, there's about 45 different signals of depression and suicide in males, and that are different from those that are described among females. And so it's really important for us to understand both sexes' way of grieving and expressing a need for help.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you've been doing really well in promoting the book. It sounds a bit cynical, but I've been intrigued at you getting involved in the arguments around the school massacres, the school shootings, and using that to talk about, the father deprivation issue,
Yes.
making the point that an awful lot of the people, the perpetrators of the massacres are fatherless young men.
Yes.
I don't know. I've been sort of thinking about that and thinking it makes me squirm a little bit, because I worry it's drawing too long a bow. I mean, millions of father-deprived young men aren't committing school massacres. There are a whole range of other issues involved here.
Oh,
I don't know. Did anyone challenge you on that?
no, you're the first, but that's fine. I think, but it's not. Here is the challenge: when boys hurt, when they take guns, for example, and commit suicide, no one pays attention. But boys who hurt us. They hurt us in a lot of different ways. I mentioned in passing a few minutes ago, ISIS recruits are almost all fatherless boys. Obviously, 99.9% of boys growing up without dads do not do school or mass shootings. They do not join ISIS. So that's the extreme of what fatherlessness is often highly connected to. But on the less extreme level, where the boy, even where it's extreme for the boy, he commits suicide and kills himself, there's local funerals, and then no one goes ahead and says, gee, maybe if we had fewer guns, he wouldn't have been likely to do that. Or maybe if we spent more time trying to understand him, or if he had a father who was connected to him, or even a role model that was connected to him, or even if the schools had a higher percentage of male teachers, so that boys don't have to go from female-only homes to female-only schools. And then we say, I wonder why they suddenly found a gang leader was a good role model. And so these questions are not being asked when it's anything less than a mass shooting. Deeply, deeply cynical and troubling and sad, but it really proves the points that both of you and I have spent our recent lives of making.
Yeah, no. Look, I as I said, I was very ambivalent about it, because
Yes.
I obviously have worked a lot of my life trying to speak out about what's happening to boys and the importance of fathers in boys' lives. So I think it's fantastic to highlight that. And the fact that in America particularly there's some serious conversations happening around that issue is wonderful. I just a bit worry about the sort of causal links. There are so many complexities here.
Yeah.
And I was delighted to see you highlighting some of these issues in your new book. But one of the problems I could see you tiptoeing, because one of the problems in talking about fatherlessness is also, how do you do that without attracting anger from single mums? And
Yes.
you're very careful about that.
And so there is a fair amount in the book about, what can a single mom do? And for one thing, what she can do is to question whether or not she doesn't have a father involved, because the father does things that she considers irresponsible, like roughhousing, putting the child in jeopardy by roughhousing, by doing things that are very adventure and exploratory and orientation, or is insensitive because he forces the child to finish his or her piece before they have their ice cream, and he should be more sensitive than that. There's a great many things that fathers do that are extremely different from what mothers do. What we find is that children who do the best have a tension between the mothers and fathers that I call like a checks and balances, and that fathers have not studied what they don't. I don't know a father who knows that when he roughhouses, he's increasing the likelihood of a boy or a girl being able to distinguish between being assertive and aggressive. I don't know a father who's able to explain to a mom that when he roughhouses, he's creating a bond with that child that he's able to leverage to have that child go to bed at an earlier time for fear that they will lose the opportunity to roughhouse. And that bond allows that father to set, and not just set boundaries and then repeat them when they're not obeyed, like moms are more likely to do, but to enforce boundaries, which then forces the child to focus not on immediate gratification, but on postponed gratification. And
Yeah.
postponed gratification is the single most important ingredient coming from enforced boundaries that leads to children being able to better in school, to if they want to join a basketball team, to having the discipline to know all the different plays in the basketball team, and so on. And so that leads to boys being proud of themselves as opposed to ashamed of themselves, which leads to boys being more likely to participate rather than withdraw. When boys
where we started this whole point was about, that there are lots of women who don't want to buy into that tension that's inevitably there between the parenting styles of men and women, and who thinks it's easier to do it on their own. And where I think you are far too kind to single mothers is, you praise the job they do, as, many of them do a heroic job raising children on their own, and I agree with that, but you don't call them out on the fact that there are so many single mothers out there who are embracing the opportunities provided to them by the family law system to just push men out of their children's lives. Yes. And that is absolutely reprehensible, and we need to talk more about that. Karen Strawn, of course, is a classic example of someone who talks a lot about that, and women being irresponsible in that respect. I don't mean to quarrel with you on everything, Warren, because I think there's so many issues you highlight in the boy crisis which are extremely important. I was pleased you were talking a lot about the whole issue of children in de facto relationships. And that's a fascinating area. Someone once said to me that has been one of the most important areas of social science research in recent years. The emergence of research showing that kids in de facto relationships aren't doing as well as we thought they would. There was an assumption by many people that, the children would be the glue. We're two people who love each other and we're having kids together, and that will mean that having the children together will mean that those relationships are as stable as a marriage. The marriage is just a piece of paper. And it was fascinating in Australia when our first research started to come through showing that is absolutely not the case, that these marriages are just as unstable, these de facto relationships are just as unstable with or without children. That people were really surprised by that. Yes. And you've got very good data in your book about that.
Yes, and this is, so there's, when in the United States, 53% of women under 30 who have children without being married. And so, but this group of people without being married, this has many dimensions to it. Some of them, have children by, anonymous sperm, others by identified sperm, others by people who are a boyfriend, others by a boyfriend who was a loser, from their perspective, and others, a small, relatively medium-sized to small group, are living with somebody, and they fall into the category that you were just talking about. Well, we're living in the same house, we have a relationship, it's all going to be fine. Marriage is just a contract and piece of paper, but you're absolutely right. The data shows that after 2 years, it's 40% of the children do not have any contact with their fathers, or else very minimal contact with their fathers for the next 3 or 4 years after
Yep.
that. And
Yep.
so obviously there's the father involvement dimension of children who grow up without being married is very significant. So we just have to fit, no matter what our moral beliefs are, we're all in favor of female freedom. But female freedom stops when a woman makes a free choice to have a child. And once that free choice to have a child occurs, then her entire focus ideally changes to what is best for my child. And among the things that's best for a child is to have stability for the child and a father involved in that stable relationship. I am not a moralist. I am not somebody who says you're a sin if you have sex outside of marriage or you're not married. If you don't have children, do whatever you'd like to do. But if you have children, we now know that marriage does create a type of stability that children yearn for, need, and flourish, especially when the father is not just a money maker. Another piece of research I discovered in doing the boy crisis was that if you have to choose, once a family has an income more than $50,000, almost all of the time, if you have to choose between a father's time and a father's dime, if you will, the father's time is a lot more important to the child, both boy and girl, than a father's dime, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I was very interested in the way you set that up, Warren, because you talk about, for instance, what would make a man happier, to be a third grade teacher or to be an engineer. You're talking to men, which is a wonderful idea about what will really fulfill them, what will really give them purpose in life. But you do tend to have it in for doctors, lawyers, and engineers. And I don't know. I mean, I know, I get that. I get what you're saying about the long hours that in many of these demanding careers, meaning it's very hard to be a good father. But
Let's see.
yeah,
Go ahead.
go on. You go on.
I would break that down a little bit there. I think being a lawyer oftentimes does help you become successful by listening to a person for a few minutes to pick up the gist of what they're saying, and then while they're developing their argument, to begin to formulate how you can either interrupt them or choose their weak point to be able to defeat them. And that is a type, if you're a really good lawyer who's working 60, 70 hours a week also, and you're doing that every day, and then you come home to your wife or your children, and you're applying that same thing that you've learned to do that's made you successful at work, your wife often doesn't feel heard and your children don't feel heard. And so often the things that make you successful at work as a lawyer often make you unsuccessful at home. So that's the lawyer aspect of it. The medical doctor aspect of it is that oftentimes a medical doctor works long hours and has to be responsive to every emergency outside, and that does sometimes undermine the ability of the children to get the attention that they need. The engineering part of it is that many men just they know that they can make a good living being an engineer, but oftentimes they are an engineer and it's not their dream, it's what they can, and so because they're good at it and they know they can make good money at it, and a woman will be attracted to them because of those two things, they oftentimes don't even allow themselves to get in touch with what I call the glint in their eye. And I'm saying to men, be an engineer if that's the glint in your eye. But if you really would love to be that artist, that writer, that actor or whatever, or do something in a nonprofit, then nurture that for a while and see if you can be economically responsible with that. So that's sort of my take on those three.
I just think being a doctor can be a glint in your eye for very good reasons. These are jobs where people are doing not, sometimes they're out there to make lots of money, that's true, but sometimes, I know so many doctors who work so hard helping people, doing wonderful things to keep people healthy. And the lawyers, Warren, who are slaving long hours to bail out men in family court. I have lawyers who are working to try to do something about the domestic violence laws, and I want to talk about my dad. My father, who was an academic, an extremely successful, eminent academic, worked incredibly hard, but was also an amazing father. He worked a lot from home. I mean, I think we have to be very careful not to suggest that, as you know, as some of the people working in this area do, that you know these traditional male careers preclude the possibility of being good fathers. And there's all, and you know, many women are moving into demanding careers too, and you know, it's a question of balance. It's a question of trying to hopefully being in a relationship where one person can pick up the slack at some times. But I want to put in a word for men in traditional jobs who are contributing to our society and also are good dads. We don't want to denigrate that.
I would 100% agree with you, and I would even take that a step further, Bettina, which is a lot of because in the old days, the society had men's sense of purpose really clear. You train yourself to be disposable either in war or work as hard as you can at work and be an effective disposable in work, like the Japanese call the executives. They say they oftentimes die of karoshi, which is death from overwork or death at the desk. And so, and now today we don't need as many men usually fighting in most countries in wars, and we also don't have the male as breadwinner being the sole definer of masculinity.
Warren, anyway, great pleasure. I'm very excited about your new book, The Boy Crisis. I hope people will track it down. I'm sure it's available through Amazon in Australia. And there is a wealth of information in there that will interest people, and that parents, fathers and mothers need to look very carefully at to learn more about what's happening to our boys. So I hope we'll have more conversations like this in the future, Warren.
Absolutely. I love the vigorous interchange. I also love speaking to somebody who knows a great deal and has done her own research, and also one of the few women in the world who really has the courage to speak up about these issues, and especially doing it from a liberal perspective, which is usually seduced into feminism only and males as being part of the negative patriarchy. So I doubly honor your courage, Bettina. You're really one of a kind in this world.
Thank you, Warren. We'll talk soon. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Very good.